Friends, we're beginning a new worship series today and for this month. And if anyone ever tells you that they think the Bible is boring, that's how you know that they've not yet read it. Because I want to tell you, as we enter into this season with the prophets, that we need to buckle up. Because it is going to be a wild and strange and holy trip each of these Sundays, and especially today. The rabbis had a euphemism for Scripture. They called it that which defiles the hands, because they recognized that the holy word of God is a truth that sears. It's a revelation once given that can't be gotten rid of. We hear and then we become liable for what we have heard. And it was a custom among our ancient ancestors to hold the prophetic scroll of Ezekiel back. And the rabbis believed that no one was ready to read it or study it or even hear it until they were 30. This is the NC-17 version. It is a destructive truth. It is sanctified to destroy our illusions, to destroy our false peace, to destroy our fruitless faith and our pretty lies. So if you're under 30 today, maybe you shouldn't listen. And if you're over 30, the time has come to gird your loins, because the prophets are many things and all of them are good, but they are sent to save us, not to reassure us. They don't come with soothing lullabies. They roar to wake us up so that we stay awake. The prophets are our spiritual alarm clocks, and we silence them to our own peril. So I want to invite you to hear the revelation from the 10th chapter of the book of Ezekiel. This is the vision trance that he had when he was snatched up in the spirit and shown from Babylon and shown the inside of the temple in Jerusalem. Ezekiel writes, "I looked, and I saw beside the cherubim 4 wheels, one beside each of the cherubim, and the wheels sparkled like topaz. As for their appearance, the 4 of them looked alike. Each was like a wheel intersecting a wheel, and as they moved, they would go in any of the 4 directions the cherubim faced. The wheels did not turn about as the cherubim went. The cherubim went in whatever direction the head faced without turning as they went. Their entire bodies, including their backs, their hands, and their wings, were completely full of eyes, as were their 4 wheels. And I heard the wheels being called the whirling wheels. Each of the cherubim had 4 faces. One was the face of a cherub, the second the face of a human being, the third the face of a lion, and the fourth the face of an eagle. And then the cherubim rose upward. And these were the living creatures I had seen by the Kibar River. And when the cherubim moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the cherubim spread their wings to rise from the ground, the wheels did not leave their side. And when the cherubim stood still, they also stood still. And when the cherubim rose, they rose with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in them. And then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. And while I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. And these were the living creatures I had seen beneath the God of Israel by the Kibar River. And I realized they were the cherubim. Each had 4 faces and 4 wings, and under their wings was that which looked like human hands. And their faces had the same appearance as those I had seen by the Kibar River. And each one went straight ahead. And what you heard in that description was Ezekiel watching as the heavenly throne came and the glory of God rested upon it and then left the temple. The book of the Bible bearing Ezekiel's name starts like this. In the 30th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day, when I was among the exiles by the Kibar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Before Ezekiel was a prophet, Ezekiel was a priest. And he lived in a dangerous place and in a dangerous time. And church, there's a whole swath of our sacred history that we don't teach. If you've been around here for a while, you've heard me say that the beginning of the story of God's people is Exodus. The story of God liberating the Hebrew people from enslavement. The chosen people were enslaved. They were oppressed by the wealthy and powerful empire in Egypt. And the story of God setting them free, the power of God overcoming the power of empire, it is the first foundational story of the people of faith. And you'll say to me, but Pastor Kate, Exodus is the second book of the Bible. And I will say to you, yes, like all true stories and good movies, there is a prologue. It's called Genesis. But the first story, the defining story of God liberating of God's people is God liberating God's people from the systemic sin of slavery. And our spiritual ancestors and our Jewish brothers and sisters today will tell you that the Passover story, the story of that Exodus, is the sacred defining center of the living faith in God. But there is another equally important and equally formative event in the life of Israel. And if the story of God's chosen people begins with the Exodus, if that is the ever-present beginning, then the exile is the counterweight. It's the other defining historical event that forever changed and redefined the people's identity and culture and future. And you say to me, the exile, Pastor Kate, what is that? I've never heard of it. And I will say to you, well, that's not really your fault, because we don't put the stories of the exile in our children's Bibles. We don't make Veggie Tales about them. And pastors like me don't preach from this part of our sacred history, nearly enough, but all of the voices of the prophets that you find come before, during, and after the exile. So if the experience of Exodus was really the first faith story, that story of a people who were enslaved and without hope or future or an identity, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, the God of the universe showed up and said, I heard your cry, and I am the God of the whole earth and all of history, and you are my special possession, and you don't know me, but I know you, and I have made an everlasting covenant with your ancestor, and I have set aside for you a promised land, and today, 10 plagues later, today I will liberate you. And after that moment, God liberated the people, and the people found themselves stunned in a wild and unfamiliar wilderness desert place, and they were drinking water from a rock, and they were eating manna that had fallen from heaven, and they were following a pillar of smoke by day and a column of fire by night on their way to a land flowing with milk and honey, and the whole time they were wondering, what does this mean? Who is this God? And who are we now that we belong to a great Redeemer? So we've taught you the story of Moses going up the mountain and bringing down the covenants and sharing with the people a new way of living, a way full of holy limits, of faith, not violence, of limits that bring life. And you probably know the story of after 40 years of wandering in the desert, learning the ways of God and unlearning the ways of empire. You learned how the covenant showed them that every area of life was sacred, not just how you worship, but how you eat and what you wear and how you live and how you treat your neighbor and the stranger and how you do business and how you use power. God's covenant says all of it is a matter of faith. God's covenant says there is no faith-life balance because all of it, your whole life, is worship. And the people came into the promised land, and after a time they asked for a king, bad idea, and then eventually they got David, who was God's friend, and there was an everlasting covenant, and then that's kind of when we stop reading the Bible. There's just kind of the boring bits, right? This king came up, he was bad news. That king came up, he was bad news. There's a couple dark years, yada, 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 Jesus. That's kind of how we read our Bible. But the part that we yada, yada, yada over was the heart of the First Testament of the Hebrew Bible. It's the story of after the people got into the promised land, after the people got free, and what they did with their freedom. And what they proceeded to do is what humans always do, which is what looked good to them. They used their freedom and their power and their blessing to live like a real nation. And they became so confident that they were God's special people and that God had made a forever covenant with them on Mount Sinai, that God had made another unconditional promise to their King David to keep one of his ancestors on the throne forever. They became so confident that their capital city, Jerusalem, was God's throne room and that their temple was God's own house. They became so confident in who they were and what they had that the people just started living their best lives according to their own hearts. And they were trusting God to keep God's promises, and they were confident in the power of their sacrifice and their worship and their religion, and they just kind of shaved the corners off of the covenant. Well, we can charge a little bit of interest just to make a little bit of profit. We aren't really going to let indigents just wander onto our field and glean our grain. And if our neighbors can't hold on to their ancestral land, well, they don't deserve it. And God kept sending them prophets, Elijah and Elisha and Isaiah and Amos and Micah, saying to them essentially, and here is an unauthorized translation of all the prophets, Houston, we have a problem. You aren't living like my people. Return to me. Return to the covenant. You are sowing death. You're very religious, but you aren't faithful. You worship me, but you don't follow me. And some people listened. But the powerful authorities said, how dare you accuse me of unfaithfulness just by looking at my actions and pointing out that they break the covenant? You don't know my heart. Until one day, in 722 BCE, the Assyrian army rolled into Israel, and Israel had split into two kingdoms by that point. So this was the northern kingdom with Ephraim as with Samaria as its capital. And this Assyrian army rolls in and conquers the capital city of Samaria. And if you're thinking Samaria, is that like the Samaritans from the New Testament that Jesus is always talking about? Yes, it is. And led the people away in chains. And then the people in the southern kingdom of Judah watched that happen and were like, stinks to stink. That's just what you get. I guess now it's clear who God's truly beloved and faithful people are, so let's just keep on keeping on. And they did until one day in 597 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar rolled into Jerusalem, and the Babylonian Empire overpowered and conquered Israel and took the king and all the elites into captivity, the priests, the artisans, the wealthy into exile, and left behind a puppet vassal king. And that's how Ezekiel left his life as a priest in Jerusalem and came to live as an exile on the edge of the Babylonian Empire by the Kibar River. Because when you are in exile, you can't be a priest, because there's no temple left to minister in. There's no altar to offer sacrifices on. That's been destroyed by an invading army. And so Ezekiel found himself sitting with the others on the edge of the river with profound disorientation, an exact inversion of the kind of wonder his ancestors felt on the edge of the Red Sea. What just happened here? If you look at Psalm 136, you'll find a psalm of people remembering the beginning of their life with God. 136 goes, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. His love endures forever. Him who brought Israel out from among Egypt. His love endures forever. With a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, his love endures forever. To him who divided the Red Sea asunder, his love endures forever, and brought Israel through the midst of it. His love endures forever, but swept Pharaoh and his army into the Red Sea. His love endures forever. To him who led his people through the wilderness, his love endures forever. When the people came out into freedom, Moses and Miriam and Aaron led the people in song, and they were asking, where did this God come from? And who are we now that this unbelievable thing has happened to us, now that we are free? Yesterday we were powerless slaves, and today we are the special chosen possession of the God of the universe, and we have a future filled with hope. And then centuries later, Ezekiel and his friends are sitting at the edge of another body of water and wondering, Where did our God go? Who even are we now? Yesterday, we were the special chosen possession of the God of the universe. And a sign of our identity was our life in the promised land and worship in the temple. And today, we sit in the dusty hills of Babylon, and there's no milk, and there's no honey, and there's no worship, and we are enslaved again. Ezekiel is living in a humanitarian crisis, in a cultural crisis, in a political crisis, but mostly it's a theological crisis. I just read you Psalm 136. The very next psalm is 137, and it's about this other event. By the waters of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion, which is another word for Jerusalem. There on the poplars, we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." And we said, "How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" Do you see, church, how the people of faith were birthed out of wonder, an unanticipated salvation, a new life and hope and promise that have come from God, and now generations later, the people are overcome by a different kind of wonder. What happened? How did we get here? I thought God loved us. We believed God's promises. We lived in a land flowing with milk and honey. The temple we built was God's throne room forever. God promised to love us forever. Why didn't God protect us from our enemies? Why wasn't God faithful to us? We never quit praying. We never quit offering sacrifices. We scrupulously observed every sacred ritual. We perpetually worshiped. And any part of the covenant we didn't keep, we more than made up for with offerings and sin offerings and prayers. We were faithful to God. Why wasn't God faithful to us? Those were the questions in the broken hearts of the people. And one day, Ezekiel looked up and saw a windstorm coming out of the north and 4 living creatures who were the chariot of fire. And out of that chariot came the appearance of the glory of the Lord, and Ezekiel fell on his face and worshiped. And in that moment, he became a prophet. And God filled his mouth with the answers to the questions on the people's hearts. And God, through Ezekiel, told the people, what happened to you isn't proof that I wasn't faithful to you, but evidence that you weren't faithful to me. Over and over again, through Ezekiel, God tells them, yes, you never stopped praying and sacrificing and offering thank offerings and sin offerings and worshiping in this big ornate temple, but I never asked you to build me a temple. I never needed you to build me a house. The whole earth is mine. But I set you apart so that through you all nations would be blessed. God, through the prophet Ezekiel, says to the people, yes, your altars were full of sacrifices, but your streets were full of the blood of the widows and the orphans and the strangers. And if you read chapters 20 and 22 of the book of Ezekiel, if you are feeling brave, through Ezekiel, God tells them, you forced the poor to labor on the Sabbath. You sacrificed your children's future to your greed. You used the bodies of powerless people to quench your sexual lust. You oppressed widows and orphans and foreigners. You condoned exploitation and usury, and you took bribes and encouraged predatory lending. You enriched yourselves on the misery and desperation of others. You followed violent leaders. You denied justice to the powerless. The temple was full of rich, hypocritical priests, and you listened to false prophets who said peace, peace, when there was no peace. You blasphemed the name of God to justify your political agendas, and then you trotted up to the temple to worship and make sacrifices for your sin and giving thanks to God for the abundance that came out of breaking the covenant. And then you said, this is the house of the Lord, this is the house of the Lord, this is the house of the Lord. No evil can befall us because we live in the city with the temple of the house of the Lord. The temple will stand but forever, and no enemy can overcome us. And God says, no. The practice of worship does not excuse you from keeping the covenant. The practice of worship does not excuse you from the practice of justice. And in his vision, the angel shows Ezekiel the people worshiping idols in the temple. In the temple, they were worshiping idols, believing that God doesn't see. And Ezekiel sees a vision of God covered in eyes because, as Diane said, God does see. You If you do not keep my covenant with your lives, through Ezekiel, God says, then you don't worship me, no matter how often you pray in the temple. And so Ezekiel has this strange vision where he sees the holy chariot coming down and the glory of God climbing up in it, and then moving up out of the Holy of Holies and crossing the threshold of the temple and leaving the building and resting on a mountain to the east. And to the brokenhearted people wondering, how could this be? To the brokenhearted people who are asking, why has God abandoned us? Ezekiel has two answers. God did not abandon you. You abandoned God. God will not allow the holy name to be used to sanctify violence and injustice. And worship is not the price we pay in order to be able to choose evil. Through Ezekiel, God is showing the people, I did not bring calamity upon you. You brought calamity upon yourselves when you turned from me and the way of life, which is shalom. And I want us to see, church, the incredible beauty and power of this piece of scripture. I want us to stop for a moment and marvel that this story, the story of the people's failure and unfaithfulness, the story of their pain and loss and doubt and despair, this story is preserved in our sacred book and kept with the same wondrous reverence as the stories of deliverance and righteousness. Because if your sincere desire is to love and serve God, then you don't just value the stories that make you look faithful. You know the glory weight of the hard stories that help you be faithful. These are hard words that Ezekiel has. They're terrifying visions, but they remind us that God will not be mocked. And we can't get away with anything. The prophets are here to make us question ourselves. Do I love God? Or do I just desire what I think faith will get me? Do I have faith in the goodness and love of the mystery of God? Or do I have a set of answers that I use to justify all my choices? Do I come seeking God? Or do I come seeking comfort? And if there are parts of my life that are displeasing to God, do I care? Or do I only think it's a problem if it has negative consequences for me? Ezekiel saw the Spirit of God leave the temple because the people didn't come to the temple to worship God. They came to the temple to get God off their backs. They came to the temple to use God to get what they wanted and what they thought they deserved. They didn't come seeking God's presence and power to make them righteous. They came to exercise their spiritual privilege and get blessing. And if we believe these words are holy, then they should make us wonder, why am I here? Do I seek the grace of Jesus so that I can be faithful? Or do I seek the grace of Jesus so I don't have to be faithful? Does grace make me care more about pleasing God or less? Because there is a marketplace version of Christianity that's not very different than the faith of Ezekiel's day. Many people in Ezekiel's day thought, hey, we have the temple and we worship God correctly, so we can do whatever we want and God will always forgive us and protect us. And many Christians today believe Jesus died on the cross for my sins and paid the full price, so now I can do whatever I want. I'm covered by grace. There's a pastor named Barbara Kingsolver who's written a ton of books, and they're good. And she tells a story one time about going to the seminary library when she was studying to become a pastor. And she had a big list of books she wanted to check out. And she kept going to the shelves and looking to where the book was supposed to be. And she'd get there, and the book wasn't there, and the book wasn't there. And she was trying to find 15 books, and she could only find 5 of them. And so she went to the librarian and said, am I doing something wrong? Like, I can't find any of these books. And the librarian just sighed and said, no. We get more books stolen from the Christian section than any other section in the library. I guess because Christians just figure they can do it. God did not give us the power of resurrection life so that we could be greedy and selfish and choose death for our neighbors. And all the voices of the prophets sing in unison. when we choose death for our neighbors, when we turn a blind eye to the suffering of the poor and powerless, we are only storing up death and destruction for ourselves. Ever and always, out of God's love, God sends the prophets to call us back home. What the prophets say over and over again is, return to me, repent and be saved. The grace of Jesus Christ does not excuse us from faithfulness. It empowers and sanctifies and resurrects us for faithfulness. So when you read this, make sure you understand, church, this is not the story of God abandoning the people. God does not leave the people. This is the story of God leaving the temple. God will never leave us or forsake us. But God is jealous for us. And God will destroy anything that separates us from God, even and especially if that's our religion. Out of the pain and death of exile, God brought new life, because this is what God does. God resurrects and redeems and reconciles, and at the center of our faith is not one sacred place, but one sacred table in every place.